For nearly 2 centuries, one of the most powerful empires on Earth ruled in the name of a bloodline it did not actually possess. The Mughal emperors called themselves the heirs of Genghis Khan, the sacred golden lineage that once gave a man the legal right to rule half the known world. Palaces were built on that claim. Wars of succession were fought and justified by it. An entire dynasty, one that would go on to build the Taj Mahal and command the wealth of an entire subcontinent, staked its legitimacy on blood that supposedly traced back to the greatest conqueror in human history. And when historians and geneticists finally traced that bloodline all the way back to its true source, generation by generation, they found something the empire spent 300 years quietly working to obscure. The man standing at the actual root of it all was never a Genghis Khan descendant at all. The historical and genetic study of Central Asian royal lineages has become one of the most active and carefully scrutinized fields in population genetics over the past 2 decades. Researchers working alongside historians at institutions including Oxford University, the University of Leicester, and the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute have combined Y-chromosome analysis with painstaking genealogical reconstruction to test claims of royal descent that, for centuries, existed only as unverifiable. Political propaganda passed down through court chronicles, written by scribes who worked directly for the rulers whose legitimacy they were documenting. This is not casual ancestry testing done for curiosity's sake. It is a rigorous cross-referencing of documented family trees against the biological record, actually carried in the male line across dozens of generations, and it has already overturned assumptions about some of history's most powerful and most mythologized dynasties. When that same level of scrutiny turned toward the Mughal Empire, one of the most consequential and enduring claims of royal legitimacy in Islamic and Central Asian history, the results exposed a deception that had been sitting in plain historical sight for 600 years, hidden less through active concealment and more through the simple passage of time and the empire's own careful storytelling. To understand why this particular deception carried such enormous stakes, you have to understand exactly how much weight the name Genghis Khan carried across the Mongol and post-Mongol political world. Under the legal and political system Genghis Khan established in the early 13th century, the title of Khan, the supreme ruler of any Mongol-derived territory, was legally restricted to men who could prove direct, unbroken patrilineal descent from Genghis Khan himself. This was not a symbolic tradition observed loosely out of respect. It was enforced political law across the vast territories the Mongol Empire once controlled, stretching from the Pacific coast of China all the way to the gates of Eastern Europe. A conqueror could seize an entire kingdom through overwhelming military force, install his own administrators, collect taxes from millions of subjects, and command loyalty from powerful generals, but without genuine Genghisid blood running specifically. Through his father's line, he legally could not call himself Khan. He would remain, forever, one crucial rung below the throne he had physically won on the battlefield, and everyone around him, from rival warlords to his own soldiers, understood exactly what that missing title implied. This legal restriction created an enormous, career-defining problem for one of history's most successful conquerors, a Turco-Mongol warlord born in 1336 in what is now Uzbekistan, a man history remembers as Timur, or Tamerlane. Timur built an empire, stretching from India in the east to the Mediterranean coast in the west, one of the largest and most feared military powers of the entire 14th century, feared enough that entire cities reportedly surrendered without resistance simply upon hearing his armies were approaching. But Timur had a fatal flaw sitting at the very center of his claim to ultimate legitimacy. He was not descended from Genghis Khan, not through his father, and not through any documented bloodline any contemporary chronicler could verify or point to. He came from a lesser Turco-Mongol clan called the Barlas, respected but genealogically unremarkable by Genghisid standards and by the strict rules of the political world he had just spent decades conquering. That origin made him permanently ineligible for the one title that mattered more than any territory he could seize. Timur's solution to this problem was as elegant as it was consequential for the 6 centuries of history that followed him. Rather than fight against a bloodline rule he could never change through conquest alone, he married into it. He took as his principal wife Sarai-Mulk Khanum, a genuine Genghisid princess descended directly from Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai. This marriage did not, and legally could not, make Timur a Khan himself. The rule was, specifically and exclusively, about patrilineal descent, and marrying a Genghisid woman changed absolutely nothing about his own father's bloodline. But the marriage did earn him a different, carefully constructed title that let him operate within the system rather than against it, Timur Gurkhan, meaning son-in-law, a designation that allowed him to rule as the true power behind a series of puppet Khans he personally selected and installed, each one carrying genuine Genghisid blood on paper, while Timur held every meaningful lever of military and political authority behind the scenes. He ruled as an emir for his entire life, never once claiming the title of Khan, a technical distinction that mattered enormously to everyone around him, even as he personally commanded an empire most contemporary kings could only dream of controlling. If you find this kind of buried political engineering as fascinating as we do, now is a good moment to hit subscribe. Because the deception Timur started with a single strategic marriage did not end with his death in 1405. It became a dynastic strategy that outlived him by nearly 200 years, quietly reshaped and reinforced by every generation of rulers who followed him. Here is where the story reaches the Mughals directly, and where the deception truly takes root. Timur's great-great-grandson, a prince named Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur, was pushed out of his ancestral Central Asian territory by rival warlords in the early 16th century after years of failed campaigns, trying to reclaim his family's lost holdings around Samarkand. Eventually, after being driven steadily further south and east, he carved out an entirely new empire in northern India, defeating the Sultan of Delhi at the pivotal Battle of Panipat in 1526 and founding what would become the Mughal Empire, almost by necessity rather than original ambition. Babur's patrilineal line, the bloodline that determined his own legal claim to titles and inheritance under both Timurid and Mongol tradition, traced directly back to Timur, the emir who was never legally entitled to call himself Khan. But Babur's mother, a woman named Kutlug Nigar Khanum, carried something his father's line conspicuously did not. She was a documented, genuine descendant of Genghis Khan through the Chagatai line, giving Babur real, verifiable Genghisid ancestry through his mother rather than through his father. This single genealogical detail became the foundation of an enormous, multi-generational political sleight of hand that the Mughal dynasty relied on for the rest of its 200-year existence. In the patrilineal political traditions that both Timurid and broader Mongol society technically operated under, inheritance, legal legitimacy, and royal title were supposed to pass exclusively through the father's line, never the mother's. By that established standard, Babur's Genghisid ancestry, real and genuine as it undeniably was, should not have qualified him or any of his descendants for the kind of sacred political legitimacy Genghis Khan's bloodline was specifically designed to confer. But the Mughals built their entire imperial identity, their court ceremonies, their official histories, and their public self-presentation around emphasizing that maternal Genghisid connection loudly, while quietly minimizing the far more inconvenient truth about who their actual patrilineal founder had been. The dynasty's own name gives away the entire strategy if you know what to listen for. Mughal is simply the Persian and Central Asian pronunciation of the word Mongol, an empire founded at its patrilineal core by a man whose father's bloodline had absolutely nothing to do with Genghis Khan spent 3 centuries calling itself, quite literally and quite deliberately, the Mongols. The genetic science confirming this centuries-old pattern comes from one of the most famous and most widely cited studies in modern population genetics, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2003 by a team led by geneticist Tatiana Zergel at Oxford University's Wellcome Trust Center for Human Genetics. The team analyzed Y-chromosome markers, the specific genetic material passed almost unchanged exclusively from father to son across generations, spanning the enormous territory the former Mongol Empire once controlled. What they discovered was a single, extraordinarily widespread genetic signature, a so-called star cluster pattern indicating explosive, rapid population growth radiating outward from one single male ancestor roughly 1,000 years ago, appearing at strikingly high frequency across a geographic range that corresponds almost exactly to the territory Genghis Khan's empire once physically controlled. The researchers calculated that this single Y-chromosome lineage is carried today by approximately 16 million living men, roughly 0.5% of the entire male population of the world, making it one of the single most successful genetic lineages ever documented in recorded human history, a pattern that strongly matches what you would statistically expect from Genghis Khan himself and his numerous immediate male descendants, who historically fathered enormous numbers of children across the territories they personally conquered and administered. Here is the detail that connects this landmark genetic study directly back to Timur, and from Timur directly forward to the Mughals who claimed his legacy. When researchers have specifically examined Y-chromosome data from populations claiming documented Timurid patrilineal descent, the results consistently fail to show the Genghis Khan star cluster signature at anywhere near the frequency you would statistically expect, if the actual patrilineal founder of that specific line had genuinely been part of the Genghisid bloodline himself. This is exactly, precisely what the surviving historical record already predicts. Timur was never legally a Khan specifically because he was never a Genghisid by blood, and the Y-chromosome evidence, emerging 600 years later from laboratories he could never have imagined existing, quietly confirms in genetic data what medieval court records already stated plainly if you knew precisely where in those chronicles to look. The empire that called itself Mongol, that built its entire public legitimacy on invoking Genghis Khan's sacred lineage that ruled from the Peacock throne in Delhi for 200 years using that borrowed legacy as political and religious capital carried Genghis Khan's actual blood through only one great-grandmother, a connection diluted almost immediately across subsequent generations, while its true, unbroken father-to-son royal line traced back to a brilliant general who, it is worth taking a moment to look at exactly how this borrowed legitimacy played out across the emperors who followed Babur, because the pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. Babur's son, Humayun, spent years in exile after losing his father's newly won territory. And when he eventually reclaimed the throne, court historians commissioned during his reign continued emphasizing the Genghiside maternal connection as proof of the family's destined right to rule. His grandson, Akbar, widely considered the empire's greatest consolidator, went even further, commissioning elaborate illustrated manuscripts tracing the imperial family tree back through both Timur and, wherever the genealogists could plausibly draw the connection, toward Genghis Khan himself. Blending fact, tradition, and convenient omission into a single unbroken visual narrative meant to be displayed and admired rather than scrutinized. By the time Shah Jahan commissioned the Taj Mahal and Aurangzeb expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, the distinction between maternal and paternal Genghiside ancestry had been so thoroughly blurred by generations of court propaganda that most subjects of the empire likely never questioned it at all, and quite possibly many of the emperors themselves, raised from birth on carefully curated dynastic histories, never fully grasped how selectively their own family's story had been told to them. This borrowed legitimacy became especially consequential during moments of internal crisis, when Mughal princes turned on each other and needed every possible source of legitimacy they could invoke to justify seizing the throne from their own brothers. The most brutal example came in 1657 and 1658, when the aging Shah Jahan fell seriously ill and 4 of his sons launched a devastating war of succession against one another, a conflict that ended with Aurangzeb imprisoning his own father in the Agra fort for the remaining 8 years of his life and executing his brother Dara Shikoh in front of his own young son. Throughout that brutal conflict, court propagandists on every competing side invoked the family's ancient Genghisid and Timurid heritage to argue for their particular candidate's superior right to rule. Great-great-grandfather Babur had first assembled generations earlier from a single Genghisid great-grandmother. Nobody involved in that war paused to interrogate whether the underlying genealogical claim actually held up under the empire's own stated rules, because by that point the story had been repeated so many times across so many generations of court historians that it had effectively become indistinguishable from settled fact in the minds of everyone who had grown up inside the empire's own mythology. This is far from a uniquely Mughal phenomenon either, which is part of what makes the pattern so genuinely fascinating to historians of political legitimacy more broadly. Similar bloodline workarounds appear repeatedly across Central Asian and Islamic dynastic history, wherever ambitious rulers without the technically correct genealogical credentials needed a path toward legal and religious legitimacy that raw military conquest alone could not provide. The specific mechanism the Mughals relied on, emphasizing a single strategically important maternal ancestor while quietly de-emphasizing an entire patrilineal line that didn't qualify, shows up again and again in royal genealogies across multiple unrelated dynasties and centuries. Suggesting this was never really a uniquely Mughal deception, so much as a well-worn playbook available to any sufficiently powerful ruling family willing to use it. It's worth pausing here on something genuinely important, because a claim this dramatic deserves careful scrutiny rather than exaggeration for the sake of a good story. Between the star cluster Y-chromosome pattern and known Genghisid-ruled territories, but this population-level genetic evidence cannot retroactively test Timur's own individual remains directly, since no confirmed, universally accepted sample of Timur's personal Y-chromosome DNA has ever been sequenced and published in peer-reviewed research, despite his tomb in Samarkand having been opened and studied by Soviet archaeologists in 1941. What the genetic evidence actually provides is strong, statistically significant population-level support for a pattern. Historians had already established decades earlier through documented court records, formal marriage contracts, and detailed contemporary chronicles written by scholars who lived through and personally recorded these events, including Timurid-era histories that explicitly and matter-of-factly describe Timur ruling as Gurkhan rather than Khan specifically because he lacked patrilineal Genghisid descent. Historian Beatrice Forbes Mans, whose research on Timur's political rise remains one of the most cited academic sources on the subject in Western scholarship, has documented this distinction extensively, noting that Timur's entire political strategy depended on visibly and publicly working around a bloodline requirement he could not personally satisfy, rather than concealing that he lacked it from the people he ruled. In other words, this was never actually a secret during Timur's own lifetime, nor during the early Mughal period either. It gradually became something closer to a secret only across the following centuries, as Mughal court propaganda increasingly blurred the sharp line between maternal and paternal ancestry to strengthen the dynasty's public claim to greatness in the eyes of subjects and later historians who may not have tracked the genealogical fine print nearly as closely as Timur's own contemporaries clearly had. There is something genuinely striking about how long this particular sleight of hand managed to hold, largely unquestioned, across the full sweep of Mughal history. For nearly 200 years, the Mughal emperors, Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, ruled one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires on the entire planet, commissioning architectural wonders like the Taj Mahal, presiding over a genuine golden age of art, administration, and religious tolerance under rulers like Akbar, all while their foundational imperial identity rested on a genealogical claim that was, at its patrilineal core, a carefully managed workaround, rather than the unbroken sacred bloodline their own dynastic name openly implied to every subject, ambassador and rival ruler who ever heard it. The word Mughal appears today in history books, in the name of one of the most extensively studied empires on Earth, permanently attached to a founder who was never actually entitled, by his own era's political and religious law, to call himself what his descendants' dynasty name so confidently suggested he was. What makes this discovery resonate so far beyond just one dynasty's genealogical footnote is what it reveals about how political legitimacy has always actually functioned, in the Mongol successor world and far beyond it, across nearly every royal tradition in recorded human history. A bloodline requirement, no matter how strictly enforced on paper or how deeply embedded in religious and legal tradition, has never been more powerful than a sufficiently determined, sufficiently intelligent person's ability to reshape the surrounding story until the requirement itself stops mattering to anyone still living to remember why it once did. Timur could not become a Khan through blood, so he built something else entirely, powerful enough and enduring enough that the underlying distinction eventually has stopped mattering to almost everyone except careful historians. And 600 years later, geneticists working with Y-chromosome data he could never have imagined existing when he made that calculated marriage in the 14th century. His descendants built one of history's truly great empires, on top of a foundation his own contemporaries knew was, by the explicit rules of their own political world, technically illegitimate at its patrilineal root, and it worked anyway, for 200 years, precisely because power, once thoroughly secured and passed down long enough, has a remarkable way of quietly rewriting the very rules that were originally designed to prevent it from existing in the first place. If uncovering the genealogical secrets buried inside history's great dynasties is exactly what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed. Because bloodlines like this one are rarely as simple or as sacred as the empires built on top of them wanted the wider world to believe. The Mughals ruled in Genghis Khan's name for 2 full centuries, built their entire imperial identity and public legitimacy around a legacy of conquest and sacred bloodline they had, in reality, inherited only in fragments, through one great-grandmother rather than through any unbroken line of fathers and sons stretching back to the great Khan himself. 600 years later, the surviving historical record and the genetic science quietly agree on something the empire itself spent generations working hard to obscure. The throne was real. The empire, the architecture, and the 2 centuries of recorded history were all entirely real. The bloodline it was publicly built on was, from the very beginning, never quite what its own name so confidently claimed it to be. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this entire story, once you sit with it for a moment. An empire that left behind some of the most breathtaking architecture in human history, that governed hundreds of millions of people across 2 centuries, that reshaped the art, language, and culture of an entire subcontinent, never actually needed the bloodline it claimed in order to become extraordinary. Timur's descendants proved, generation after generation, that raw ability, ambition, and administrative brilliance could sustain an empire just as effectively as any sacred lineage ever could. They simply never trusted that truth enough to say it plainly, choosing instead to spend 600 years telling the world a slightly different story than the one their own family records, and now their own genetics, quietly tell us today.